Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our most recent episodes. Sort of a bounce back for us in support and views for sure. And before we introduce the next team in this segment, where we've been breaking down, each NBA team's off season, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. And follow us on Instagram and X at the OBT Podcast for updates. So for this episode, we're kind of switching the format up. We're going back to the single one, but then down the line, it'll go back to the duo episodes or duo multiple teams, basically. But for this one, we're sticking with one team, and that is the Toronto Raptors. So, woohoo. I know everybody's excited about this one. I'm not. But let's just, kind of start with a timeline of their events and whatnot. It's ugly, in my opinion. They finished, with the 10th seed at 500 pretty much. So 41-41. They won 41 games, lost 41 games. In my opinion, I think this is very underwhelming, especially since this team, was in championship contention in 2019. So not looking too good for me. Very odd season, I think. We saw a huge decrease in play from Fred VanVleet, and then just everything around the entire organization just seemed to be up in the air. And that's kind of where we are now. They didn't really do much. I think they played in the play-in and they lost, but, it was just ugly in general. But let's just kind of break down the roster. I don't really think there was much to be said about their season in general. Like I said, it was more of a play-in failure. And then they ended up making some interesting moves, some that I agree with, some that I don't, and definitely some that I really like. But let's just take a look at the roster and how it's currently constructed. Obviously, we got to talk about Spicy P, Pascal Siakam. Great player for sure. He's making $37 million. I think he's, very underrated at this point. Not overrated at all. I think he's right where he needs to be, but I don't necessarily think he needs to be on this squad. I think, it's probably time that they move on from him. If they moved on from Fred VanVleet, then I think they should move on from Pascal Siakam as well. But he is on this roster and he makes his team 10 times better. Then moving down the line, this is all salary based, of course. Jakob Poeltl, great center as well. They picked him up, re-signed him to a pretty decent deal, I think. But I think, this is a good fit for their squad. He does, bring some things to the table in terms of rebounding, defense, some shooting a little bit, but, it is what it is. But I think he's a good center for this squad. OG Anunoby, the man, the myth, the legend. We've been talking about him, I think, since the trade deadline, maybe even before then. Everybody's kind of been interested in this guy, and I understand why. He's got a ton of potential. He's one of those 3-and-D two-way guys, phenomenal player, and a rare breed in the NBA, like we've said multiple times on this podcast. But, they ended up keeping him, and it seems like every week it's like, even though like the trade deadline is like passed, and then it just seemed like every week there's just something coming out about, a certain team or a certain party was interested in OG, and it's like, well, why didn't a trade happen? If Toronto was really willing to deal him out, why didn't they do that? We'll get into that probably later on. But then moving down the line, Gary Trent Jr., decent guard as well. So, they kind of have like a good player, I think, at every position for their starting five. And then Dennis Schroeder, he signed there as well. I think that's a good pickup. I think he deserves the money. Played, I think, pretty above average for the Lakers. So, it's nice to see him bounce back from a career contract fumble for sure. But he's back in action, and he definitely played very well in the World Cup. Yes. And Chris Boucher, I'm not too familiar with this guy's game. I'm not going to lie. But that's what I thought. I know that he's like a power forward and he can shoot and stretch the floor. But outside of that, I can't really be too mad about having a shooter on the roster, especially with the way it's currently constructed. Then obviously Scotty Barnes. This guy's interesting. I think, in terms of his play, we did see him regress. I think we all have to acknowledge that. After a solid rookie campaign, coming off of that, it was kind of weird. I don't know. It just seemed like the production and the explosiveness just wasn't there. I don't know if he was dealing with something behind the scenes, a nagging injury. But sometimes people have down years. Can't be too mad at it. But to keep him around, you have to, because, I think this is we're going into his third year. So it was third?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So third year. Can't be too mad at it. Thaddeus Young, another vet. I think, it's nice to have this guy around. He used to be super uber athletic, but now you can definitely see the age has caught up to him, but he's still valuable, I think. And for the price that they have him tagged at, not horrible at all. Porter, Otto Porter Jr. I'm not the biggest fan of this guy. If you know, I'm obviously wearing a Wizards hoodie, but I think he robbed my franchise of a lot of money and definitely didn't put up the production. But can't be too mad at him. He's kind of floated here and there on some contending rosters. It's nice to have a floor spacer around as well. And then I think this is one of the most underrated draft picks, Grady Dick. He's obviously on this squad. He's kind of like similar to OG Anunoby in terms of like, that 3-and-D kind of deceptiveness, but he's like low key an athlete. So it's kind of interesting. He could shoot lights out, and he's super tall, but I'm surprised Orlando passed on him. So nice job for Toronto picking this guy up. Jalen McDaniels, great addition as well. Small forward, kind of another one of those wings where, they're a multi-positional defender where they can defend, due to their length and size. And it's just really nice to have guys like that on the squad. Precious Achua, this guy's interesting as well. I think he's decent, especially for the price. These guys are pretty much around for dirt cheap. These are contracts that you definitely want to keep around. And, like I said, when you have a bunch of big guys that can defend, space the floor, it's kind of interesting that they have about almost half of their roster is pretty much guys like that. Then moving down the line, Malachi Flynn, Garrett Temple. I do like this roster. I just don't think it can go anywhere. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and then we'll kind of get into a timeline of what they did in this offseason. But as currently constructed, I don't see this team going super far. I think they'll probably be another play-in team. I guess their only saving grace in terms of if they can get out of the play-in would probably be if Spicy P elevates during playoffs, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the roster, I mean, because we kind of hinted at it, like you said, going in, where it's like it's not great. It's definitely not the worst one because there are a decent amount of talented players on there, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
Siakam. Scotty Barnes. We'll see what he does in his third season, like you mentioned, had it down year again, like so many other young guys. The main
Yes.
thing for him is the shot. Can he discover, and improve on that 3-point shot? Because that's the main thing, that he's missing from his game. Obviously, Grady Dick, right? You kind of correct that in some sense because the
Yeah.
Raptors were one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the league last year. And it's not really hard to see why, right? When you look at, a lot of the guys on the roster, right? Like, Barnes didn't shoot well from three. Siakam's not a great shooter.
Hmm.
Hurdles obviously is, a non-shooter,
Right.
right? So you're already talking about three guys from that starting lineup last year, right? Who, weren't really great 3-point shooters. And then obviously you add Dennis Schroeder, right? Who's also not a great 3-point shooter.
Yeah.
I'm assuming he's going to start based off the contract they gave him. Um,
Absolutely.
so, again, like when you look at the starting five, it's not the worst, right? It's definitely not the worst. But like you said, there's a couple of guys where it just seems like, do they really need to be here? Because again, like you mentioned with Siakam, the thing with him is like you said, he's about where he needs to be in terms of how people view him, right? Because he's not viewed as a superstar,
Right.
but he's also not viewed as like, just another guy, right? Like
Right.
he's really good. Um, you know, all-star, right? Caliber player, right?
Yeah. All-star tier.
Some nights can be like an all NBA caliber guy, right? Depending
Hmm.
on how well he plays. Um, but again, he's not the guy that you want in terms of being the best player on your team. There's very few guys that can do that, right? So that's not a knock on him. It's just again kind of a sign of like, Toronto, like you mentioned, right? There was a time when, you know, they didn't, they won the title in 2019, but even before that, right, they would typically be a good regular season team.
Yeah.
And had a couple of seasons after Kawhi, right, where they had good regular
Oh,
seasons.
yeah.
Um, it just seemed like, they were always kind of missing somebody, to kind of get them over the hump, right? They had that in Kawhi, right? And since then, right, it's been Siakam, but again, not quite as good as Kawhi, obviously.
Right.
Um, so,
Well,
going into this season, I feel like we've heard a lot of Siakam rumors, right? Where it's like, hey, this team might be interested, right? Like I think we had heard, remember Atlanta.
yep.
But Atlanta, right, kind of like didn't want to give up certain guys, right? Like if I believe what it was guys like, AJ Green,
Hmm.
the guy that just drafted Buffkin, right? So I
Yeah.
mean,
And I know Buffkin was on Toronto's radar.
right. And then obviously with Siakam, I think the other factor is he's due for a super max contract, I think, coming up, right? And
Yeah.
so he gets traded, right? He loses that. So obviously, he wants to get the money first and then get traded, right? So
Right.
that's why I think there was a rumor earlier in the offseason that kind of suggested, hey, I'm not going to re-sign, with you if you trade for me, right? Because, he's trying to kind of like get the money first. Nothing wrong with that, right? That's what, pretty much everybody would be advised to do.
Yes.
Um, so, again, in terms of going back to the roster, like you mentioned, Ananobi, really good. Like you mentioned, there was a lot of buzz about him at the deadline, but it just seemed like Toronto just ended up kind of just like waving him around and then just, dangled him around just to not really do anything with it. Um, because we kept hearing, like you mentioned, like, it was like stuff like the Grizzlies were kind of interested in picking him up, right? Or, even the Warriors, I remember when we were doing that live stream on the day of the trade deadline, right? There was talk about, maybe he goes there, right?
Right.
But it seemed like Toronto set the asking price a little bit too high. And so they may be at a point now where, like, if they trade him, they might just end up kind of trading at a low value, right? Where they're no longer going to get as much as they thought.
Right.
Because, we saw what happened at the deadline, right? Where nobody was really going for insane, packages in terms of draft capital, right? Like, other than like the Durant thing, outside of that, right? Like guys weren't being moved back and forth for a crazy amount of picks, right? It was a lot of second round picks I remember that was getting
Yeah.
moved around, but not first. So I think that time has probably passed for Ananobi if a team wants him. So, maybe that makes him, easier to pick up if you're another team, but maybe Toronto might just be more hesitant, right? Because
Right.
they waited for Van Vliet. They just didn't trade him and then he ended up leaving. And that's the concern I think for some of these guys is, if you're Toronto, right, there comes a point where you're going to have to make a decision, but you could make the wrong decision and then they walk and then you get literally nothing back, right? Because again, it would have been nice to have gotten something for Fred Van Vliet, but they ended up not getting them. But in fairness, right, like, if a team is trading for him, they would need to trade for him with the understanding, like, hey, we're going to keep you long term, and maybe he wasn't willing to do that.
Right.
'Cause he knew, a Houston offer was out there for him,
Yeah,
so
I feel like he was just chasing the bag at that point. But you can't really be too mad at it because I do understand the thought process of, yeah, we didn't really get anything back from Van Vliet, but at the same time, you were able to pick up Schroeder, so it's like I think that's not the worst trade off in the world. Obviously Schroeder's not on Van Vliet's level, but he does add some sort of scrappiness that Van Vliet I don't necessarily think he had, especially due to his size. I think he was severely undersized. Schroeder's still a small guy too,
yeah, he's
but
small too, but he's
yeah,
got longer arms. He's
exactly.
a little bit, more. I guess I don't want to say explosive, like he's a more athletic, but he's a lot quicker.
Yes,
You know, Van Vliet's
on
kind of a
both
stock
ends.
ball guard.
Yeah.
Um, but it is kind of funny with Toronto because you mentioned like all of the size like at that wing forward spot,
Yeah.
and that was kind of the formula for their team. Um, even the title year, right, where they had like guys like Kawhi, right, Danny Green, obviously Siakam, right, like they had like a lot of like length,
Yeah.
movable athletic guys, right, and then
Yes.
that year a couple seasons ago where they went to the playoffs against Philly, you know, I wasn't one of them, but some of the people who picked Toronto to beat Philly, right, their thought process was, yeah, they have a lot of wing depth and forwards that can kind of bother some of Philly's smaller guards, right? Like,
Right.
they had, of course, Scotty Barnes, Ananobi, Siakam, right? Like they had a lot of options there. And it seems like they continue to do that, right? They signed out of Porter Jr. Obviously, he didn't pan out for the Raptors last year because he spent most of the time on the bench, or I guess on the sidelines because he was
Yes.
hurt, right? Which has kind of been the story for him for the last several years, right? Aside from, the 1 year in Golden State, right? Like, 3 of the last 4 seasons, right? He's barely played, if I'm not mistaken, right? He
Yes.
barely played for the Bulls,
Yep.
barely played for Orlando, obviously barely played for Toronto. Because when he plays, I think there are people that value him, especially when you're not giving him like, 20 plus million a year like the Wizards did.
Oh
Uh,
god. Yeah,
you
and
know,
when he's hitting his shots too, that's the other
right.
thing.
Yeah, and it's funny, because like I'm looking at Basketball Reference, and it was like, he shot, you know, 50% from the field, right? But again, barely played 35 from three, not terrible. He played 8 games, right?
Right.
He played 8 games, after, for the Warriors, he played 63 in the regular season. I know a lot of those he kind of rested, because they load managed him for the Warriors. He also has two nicknames. I knew O was one of them, but he has a nickname Bubba as well, which is
I
kind of
didn't
funny.
know that. I only knew
Yeah.
O.
Yeah, but just back to the roster at hand, Grady Dick, we both liked that pick, at the time when we were watching and reacting to the draft.
Yes.
Again, they desperately needed 3-point shooting. He's got size, he's got some toughness. We'll see, how that works at the NBA level, but he's got like a lot of, skills where like he should come in and be able to help right away, right? Like he's not going to start, um, but he'll definitely play a lot of minutes for
Yes.
sure, right? So I do like that. And they again, like with Toronto, they do have some flexibility in terms of some tradable contracts. Obviously, they've also kind of been tied into some other rumors, right? Like their name has been mentioned with Damian Lillard. Um, so like in terms of right now, right? Like you said, right? The ceiling is probably like a
Yes.
play-in berth. You know what I mean? Because again,
Yes.
they were a play-in team last year. I don't really feel like they got much better, because I mean, like Dennis Schroeder, right, versus Van Vliet. Van Vliet's better. Um, but at the same time, you did get better in terms of young talent by adding Grady Dick. But the rest
Youth
of the
doesn't
roster,
equal wins though. So,
right, exactly. So that's the thing. Like to me, that's where like, okay, they didn't really get much better, so I can't imagine they're gonna do much better,
right.
next season. So that's
Exactly.
kind of what I'm thinking. But again, like it is just kind of weird because like the front office, the ownership, right, seemed very stable, right, and I think a lot of people really liked a lot of what Toronto had done. But it seems like this last year or two, right, it just seems like a lot of what they're doing just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Um, and I could be wrong because I may be, because again, like they could have some crazy thing where they end up pulling off a wild trade, right, and then we're all just kind of like laughing at what we're saying right now, but
Sure.
still, like I don't know. Kind of like what you said when you were like, "Ugh," it's like that's kind of how I feel
Yeah.
about the roster. Like I said, not a bad roster, not a great roster, just kind of meh.
Yeah,
You know what
it's
I mean?
mid. Like it's average. I guess slightly above average, but like that doesn't give me any confidence in how they're gonna do. And it's like I'm looking around the conference, and there's not a lot of teams that they're better than, you know. And we've
Right.
talked about a decent chunk of these teams. Um, and oddly enough, I don't know. It's weird because I'm even looking at like division wise.
Yeah.
They're I think they're going to be worse than Brooklyn. They're going to be worse than the Knicks. They're going to be worse than Philly and worse than Boston. Like they're going to finish last in their division once again, I think.
Yeah, and we didn't really love Brooklyn's roster, right now either. Like, it's
Exactly.
not bad, but like it's not the worst one. But it's like,
I'm more
and I
confident
like
in
Bridges,
Brooklyn.
I like Johnson, I
Yeah.
like Clack. They have pieces that I like, and Toronto has pieces that I like. But
Sure.
again, it's like, that shooting is bad, and then
Yeah.
like Grady Dick will help it be better, but it's not going to be much better as a team,
Right.
unless like a couple of these guys take some, upticks in 3-point shooting, right? Like if Barnes becomes a better 3-point shooter, if
Yes.
Siakam gets a little bit better,
Yes.
um, maybe a couple of the other guys have like years where it's like, because shooting can be kind of variant, right? Like it's a stat in the NBA that's probably has like the highest level of variance compared to any other stat because
It
it's like,
fluctuates.
yeah, because like even great 3-point shooters could have down shooting years. You know
Yes,
what I mean?
we've
Like
seen it.
it happens. Like I think Steph Curry, right, the title year for the Warriors, right, he shot under 40%, I think, if I'm not mistaken, from
Right.
three.
And
And then
that's
this
low.
season, he's back in the mid, or whatever 40s again.
Right.
So it's like, and
And
again, that's the greatest shooter ever. So like if he can have, and again, that's not a quote unquote bad shooting year.
right.
Again, close to 40% is really good. But I'm saying like even for him, that's several ticks below what he normally shoots. So if he can have that, right, then
Anybody
obviously
can.
that can happen to anybody. So I mean, you know, that's the main concern because again, I like a lot of the size and versatility, but I just don't like the shooting. And it's just like, where is it going to come from in that starting five? Like, again, it's got
Yeah.
to be, because again, in that starting five, your best 3-point shooter is either going to be Ananobi, who's fine at times, right? Or Barnes, who
Right.
wasn't very good from three last year. So it's like, you know, one of those guys is going to have to be better. I guess also Siakam, because again, he's not a bad 3-point shooter, but again, like, are people concerned about him from
No, he's
behind?
not a laser. Like
No,
it's interesting, and back to the down year stuff. Like in comparison, we can look at Anthony Davis. Like we've seen him have like pretty decent years where he's a decent shooter, but then all of a sudden he's shooting
right?
low 20s, and then
Yeah,
everybody's like, "What the heck?" It just
yeah,
fluctuates. So
right,
hopefully these
exactly.
guys can have a like good shooting year. I think if they have a good shooting year, that would make me feel more confident in them coming out of the play-in. But if they have another season like they did last season, I don't foresee them coming out of there alive.
And that's the thing, like with Barnes, like he could get better as a
Sure,
shooter because he's a young guy, and like so in theory, he should be getting better every year, and he
sure.
might, because again, that's the main thing that's missing. Because I like a lot of the other stuff, from him. Because again, he was kind of the, when he was drafted, that was kind of the surprise pick that I think a lot of people you know, when they were reacting to the draft, they were like, "Wow, this guy went higher than you would have
Yeah.
expected." Because I remember, because it was like, Barnes was taken, and then after him, right, it was Suggs who was taken by Orlando, and everybody was like, "Wow, Orlando, really made it out, with the Suggs pick, and Toronto might have messed up with the Barnes pick, but for now, at least from that point on to here, right, so far Barnes has been better. We'll see if
Oh
Suggs,
yeah. Suggs just been hurt and stuff.
right,
He's had a weird career. I think he had a lot more hype coming out of college and the high school
yeah,
era.
yeah, like you said, he's definitely had a lot of injuries, so
Right.
that's obviously prevented him from really being able to take off. Because I still think he can be really effective.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Great
Yeah,
guard.
so yeah, it's just a matter of again, like, that's kind of what you got to decide if you're Toronto because you need to kind of make a decision on, hey, where are we going, right? Are we gonna be a team that's gonna be in the midst of a rebuild, or are we gonna be a team that's like, hey, maybe we go all in on one of these disgruntled stars,
Right.
because you may have the option to do either or, but you got to decide because if you don't decide and you just go in, with a roster like this, then again, you shouldn't expect a much different result than what we got last year, where they were in the play-in and they went out in kind of a disappointment, right? Because I
Yeah.
think most people thought a lot of people expected them to beat the Bulls because they were the higher seed, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
and I think they were up by double digits in that game. And what
Yes, they
happened?
were.
Right?
I think we
Nobody.
picked Toronto actually.
I think I picked the Bulls.
Okay, then I think I picked Toronto then.
Yeah, and yeah,
I
because they
was
were
in
up by double
shambles, bro.
digits, I think, at halftime. And then again, what happened? The offense just completely bogged down, and they couldn't hit anything. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the concern. Well, not kind of. That is the main
Oh,
concern with.
100%.
Um, the Pirtle thing. It is kind of funny because they did sign him, to a 4 year. I think it was $80 million deal, which is 20 million. I think is a lot, for
Okay.
him. And I don't think he's a bad player at all. And of course, as the contracts go up, it won't look, ridiculous. It is again just something to kind of keep an eye on because, like I
Yeah.
said, they have a number of guys where I'm like, are they gonna really be here long term? Like, I don't know, because even a guy like a Gary Trent Jr., he picked up his player option, if I'm not mistaken. Um, because he was a guy that I think some people expected to get some money this offseason, but I guess the money just wasn't there.
Right.
In terms of other guys got signed first. We saw that with guys getting squeezed out in free agency. So, there's a number of guys on this roster that I think, depending on what Toronto does, they could either be, kind of like, hey, they could help out another team, or
Mhm.
Toronto could use them, to pick up somebody. We'll see, because they do have some options. But as of right now, I'm not too fond of this team personally.
Yeah, I have low expectations for this squad, and that all stems from really just looking around the league and like being weak in the East is a really bad sign because the East is somewhat it's in shambles compared to the West, and I think everybody knows that. So
Right.
not looking too good for Toronto. I think there's
Yeah.
troubles in the
So,
six.
what grade do you think you'd give Toronto,
Mm.
for their offseason?
I'd probably give them a C. I think that's the highest I can give them. I don't really want to give them any lower because I think they did add some really good pieces, whether it be in the draft or free agency. So, starting with the draft, I think Grady Dick, excellent pick. Great way to capitalize on somebody falling into your hands like that. Then they signed Marquise Noel, the Cinderella hero from the NCAA tournament, to a two-way contract. Not too big of a deal, but to have him on your roster is pretty cool as well. Then they signed Jaden McDaniels and re-signed Jakob Poeltl and got Dennis Schroeder and fired Nick Nurse. So in general, I think this is we're looking at the early shades and stages of a rebuild. I just need them to fully commit, kind of like how the Wizards have, and just get rid of Siakam at that point.
Actually, it's funny. We hadn't even mentioned. Yeah, they did hire a new coach. Darko Rajakovic, I believe, is the name,
Yes.
right? Because like you mentioned, Nick Nurse, right? You know, had he had a rough year last year in Toronto, right? And there were lots of rumors about him probably being done. Like
Yeah.
it seemed like he had kind of lost the locker room,
Yep.
right? And guys just kind of just you know everything was falling on deaf ears, and then before you know it, he's gone, he's out, he went to Philly. Again, I don't know much about this guy, in fairness. I know he's from Serbia. So I know he did some coaching, I believe, for the G League. Um, but at the same time, it is always kind of intriguing to see a rookie head coach, kind of step in. Because
Right.
again, the roster is kind of similar to last year's. It's just, take out Van Vliet, replace him with Shooter, and then add in, Grady Dick. So I do kind of wonder what he does, with this roster. I think I think Schroeder mentioned, he what he saw from him. We'll see, because again, everybody always plays nice initially. We'll see how it
Sure.
works. Because I remember, not that this is going to happen, and I hope it doesn't happen, but I remember, I think it was the Pacers, right, where they had that coach, for that 1 year, right? I can't remember his name. Maybe you can remember it, but I think he had a falling out where he was kind of getting on the players, and then before you know it, he was gone after like a year. I
I
just
know
can't
who
remember.
you're talking about. I can't remember his name, but yeah.
It was,
Hopefully
yeah,
that doesn't happen. Rookie head
right,
coach, or not even really. I guess like first year head
right.
coaches, they do kind of have to
It was
deal
Nate
with a lot.
Bjorkman.
It
It
was
was
who?
Nate Bjorkman. Yeah, it
Okay.
was Nate Bjorkman because I remember, yeah, he was coaching the Pacers after one, and he was, I think, an assistant coach at one point. Then he was promoted to a head coach, and then he was getting on some of the players, and he got fired after 1 year. Um,
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think people overlook how important it is for the coach to gel with the players as much as the players gel with each other. Because,
yeah,
if you can't get through to your players and they don't respect you and they can't hear you out and vice versa, then you have an issue and you're going to lose the locker room in a second.
right. I think the human element for coaches is really important,
Yes.
and especially now where it seems like a lot of the coaches they're hired based off of their connections with the players, right?
Right.
Some of these guys used to play, obviously like say like a Darvin Ham, right? Jason Kidd, Adrian Griffin, for the Bucks, guys like that. And that's something that can't be discounted, because it is kind of funny because I remember that we saw a clip a couple weeks ago, right, where it was like a montage, right, of
Oh my goodness.
just overseas, I think, getting on the players, and
Yeah.
it was kind of interesting to see, right, because you don't normally see that from a ton of teams, I think, in the NBA, right? Like you'll see the clips of the coaches like in the huddle, right, kind of talking to players, but it normally doesn't get to the degree that we saw in some of those clips,
Yeah.
at least nowadays,
And like
you know.
when like say you're watching like NBA on TNT, I know they have the wired moments and like the mic'd up
Yeah,
moments, and they'll go in on the coaches, and the coaches, they know they're mic'd up, so they know they probably can't say some of that stuff. But I'm
right.
sure there's been times in huddles, and if you're an athlete, you know that your coach has the right to get on you if you guys aren't executing. So I'm sure that's happened in the NBA. We just probably haven't seen it too much. But yeah, that was like a rage taj of like
Yeah,
foreign coaches just going off on their players. It was pretty rough.
yeah, but
But yeah, back to you. Like, what would you give them for grade wise?
yeah, I'm kind of in the same spot as you where, like I said, probably like a C,
Okay.
because again, it's not the worst offseason and it's not a great one. Schroeder, that's fine. I mean, again, yeah, I guess he's your Van Vliet replacement. He's certainly not as expensive.
Yeah.
It's a 2-year deal, so there's no real complaints about that, right? You
Right.
sign him, you can easily trade him if you want, or you can keep him if he really pans out, right? Obviously we've seen him operate more so at his best as a guy coming off the bench, right? Not necessarily as good as a starter. So I'm
Sure.
curious to see how that plays out, for them in Toronto. Because again, just in general, right? Like, the more minutes he tends to play as a starter, right? Usually the worse it tends to look, when you have to rely on him a lot. And again, on this roster, right? They kind of have to rely on him a lot because again, he's, one of the main guys that's like a ball handler, right? Again, outside of I guess Siakam can kind of do it, Barnes can kind of do it, but those guys, because they're forwards, right? They don't handle the ball in the same way that guards do. Grady Dick, we'll see. Like you mentioned, I like that pick a lot for Toronto. I think he's a guy, like I said, that can step in, right away and contribute. Because again, he's got some pretty well defined skill sets. As a guy who can shoot, with or without the ball. Um, and again, we'll see. But like I said, I do like that. But outside of that, Jalen McDaniels, right? Philly just kind of let him go.
Crazy.
And it seemed like
And
he
we
didn't
were
really
high
do
on
a
that
whole lot
move too.
for Philly. Yeah, yeah. It seemed like he didn't do a whole lot for Philly, so we'll see what he does with Toronto. Maybe he'll have more of an opportunity, maybe not. But
Right.
again, he was playing with some decent players in Philadelphia, and they just kind of just let him go.
Yeah,
Um,
ridiculous
and
in my
replaced him
opinion.
with another guy that we'll get into soon. Um, but outside of that, yeah, not a whole lot to write home about. So I might bump it down to like a C minus, but definitely not much worse than that. Because again, it wasn't horrible,
Yeah.
but again, given what was already on the roster, there wasn't a whole lot they could do, especially because again, with Van Vliet walking, they were already capped out. So it wasn't like they could really replace him with like anybody of equal contractual values. That was the main
Exactly.
thing. Yes,
Yeah.
they replaced him with Shooter, but that's about it. But I'm kind of lukewarm on it because that's
Yeah.
how I feel. 'Cause again, I didn't expect them to do a whole lot. Toronto doesn't have a history of really grabbing free agents anyways. And this wasn't a strong free agency class. And I didn't really think they were going to do any trades because they hadn't done any. So, I mean, other than, the Pirtle one, which I guess is fine because they needed a center. But, I don't know. Like, I just, like you said, I think the word you described, you used the word mid. I think that's about,
Yeah.
where I would put it. I think it
Yeah.
was a pretty mediocre offseason for them. We've covered worse, but
Yes,
we've
we
also
have.
covered a lot better.
Yeah.
So,
It was just average, nothing more, nothing less. That's the way I put it.
exactly. And, in terms of the over under, I mean, like, again, like, like they're not really projected to do a whole. I mean, like, that's just because, again, like, what was their record last year? I mean, it was
41
basically
and 41.
41 and 41. Yeah, that's the pretty much the exact definition of
Yeah.
mediocre, right? That's
It's average.
record of 500. So I mean, you look at the Raptors, 35 and a half, 36 and a half, depending on what you look at, that's
It's worse.
worse. That's
Yeah.
actually worse, which, again, makes sense because I think there's a couple of teams that will do a little bit better, right? Like you said, I think Brooklyn will probably win a few more games. Um, Orlando maybe, that we'll get into them
Sleeper
soon.
squad, man.
Indiana for I think Atlanta, right? I mean, like there's a number of teams that I would probably take. Well, not probably. I would take over Toronto.
100%.
That's the issue. So I could definitely see them taking a step back, and wins because again, I think they downgraded at the point guard spot, but I do like what they did with the young talent. So like I said, C minus for me.
Yeah.
Um, so now I guess we'll get into more of the rumors. So just a quick one. To start off, right? So it looks like a Cavs extension with Donovan Mitchell, according to ESPN, seems pretty unlikely. This was something that we talked about when we covered Cleveland, right? The idea of like, hey, what happens, with Cleveland and Donovan Mitchell, right? They traded stuff to get him. I guess so far it hasn't. I mean, I guess it's been okay, right? Regular season they were really good, playoffs not so much. They have a chance, obviously, to take a step forward this year, but again, it's going to get to a certain point where, like, if they don't do, much, right, he could potentially leave, maybe go somewhere else. So, and again, most of these guys aren't going to sign extensions because they're going to get more, if they, have a really good year. Maybe they're all NBA like he was this year, and then he can get like a super max extension,
Exactly.
as a piece. Like, it's smart, right? Like, it makes sense if you're Donovan Mitchell because, again, there's no point.
Yeah, I
If
think
you're making
Donovan
more,
Mitchell's betting on himself in this situation, and I'm not really too worried about that. And I think the extension, like he would be up for an extension in what, like 2 years?
yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Yeah, so
exactly.
we
So,
got
I mean,
time. Like that doesn't concern me. My concern would be if we start hearing, rumors that he wants to be traded. Okay, then that's a different discussion. But
right.
in terms of
Yeah.
an extension, I'm not too worried about that. I think that the time will come, especially if he continues to have a great season like he did last season. Um, so yeah, and I'm a huge Donovan Mitchell fan. You
Same.
know that, and everybody who watches this knows that too. So I'm gonna support him whatever he does, but I think that's a really good move in terms of trying to maximize the profits that you can gain from your
Yeah.
talent.
All right, we got some interesting stuff coming out of Milwaukee. So Brian Windhorst, he believes that, a Bucks deal with Giannis is 50-50 at best. So he
Hmm.
is not quite certain that they're going to be able to retain Giannis or at the very least sign a new contract. Right.
Hmm.
And we've kind of talked about this where, we covered the Bucks where I said like they're still probably going to be really good, but I am kind of concerned about them sort of long term because I do think, some of the guys on the roster are older. They've been banged up. So Middleton seems like so far he hasn't been quite the same as he was the title year.
Right.
Lopez is 35. I think Holiday is going to be what, like 34.
Yeah.
So there's reason to be concerned. They have a rookie head coach, so we'll see how that pans out. Like I said, nothing's going to happen, obviously, this season, but just going forward, it is something to think about because again, there's always the potential that happens. I don't know if it will happen, but obviously, if Milwaukee has another really disappointing season, right, you'd be one step closer to that.
Right. And my thing is, I think his move and his career is going to be contingent on if he wins. If they go out sad again, then I can guarantee you Giannis probably will not play, in a Bucks uniform ever again. But if they continue to win and rack up championships, because we all know that's what he wants. He wants to win. He's a winning guy. So if he continues to win on that squad, I don't really foresee him trying to force his way out or just leave and decline an extension.
Right. Yeah, some more Lillard stuff, so there's kind of a lot of buzz now kind of about the idea of,
Oh
that a
god.
deal, Portland wants a Lillard deal done before camp starts. Of course, it's from the Miami Herald, so, we'll see, in terms of like, the realistic possibilities of that, but I
Right.
think it makes sense for all sides, to get something done as soon as possible.
Yes.
Mark Spears also mentioned the idea potentially of a third team, that may
As there
come
should
in,
be. There has
like
to be.
yeah, like a third team that could potentially snipe for Lillard as opposed to,
Oh,
Miami.
okay.
Um, he mentioned it was a secret team,
Oh my
so I
goodness.
have
Here
no
we
idea what
go.
that yeah, I have no idea what that means,
That just
but
sounds like they're blowing smoke up our, you know
yeah,
what?
in the East, like I don't feel like there's a lot of teams that where it would make sense to trade for him. I think obviously outside of Miami, I guess, Philly would be interesting, but again, that means Harden would have to go to a third team because he's not going to Portland.
Mm-hmm.
Um, people had mentioned Boston before, right? But I think, with the Porzingis thing, I don't feel like you could really even really do that
Nope.
at this point because that's a lot of big salaries on
That's
there.
too much
Like,
money, bro.
yeah, what does Boston have to give up that Portland would want? Milwaukee, obviously that'd be kind of intriguing, but again, I don't think they have the pieces to do that unless they get like a third or a fourth or a fifth or an 18th team or something like
Yeah. Yeah,
that.
all 32 teams involved.
Right. Yeah,
Or
exactly.
30, excuse me. It's not
Yeah,
the NFL.
Toronto, that's another one that's been rumored. From some, we talked about it, or kind of like hinted at it, right? That's something where I think that would be kind of intriguing. I don't know, which pieces Toronto would give up, right? I would think like, OG, maybe Scotty Barnes.
It would have to be wings. I feel
Yeah,
like that's all that Portland wants at this point. And they already have a solid guard room.
right. Yeah, because some people have mentioned Siakam, but I'm like, maybe,
What would be
but
the point in just getting Lillard out of that though? I don't that doesn't even put them in winning conversation in my
right.
opinion. I feel like
Yeah,
it would boost them in terms of where they stand, but I don't think
yeah.
that makes them a winning squad.
Maybe you add Grady Dick to it as well, like
Mm.
I don't know.
I don't like that.
Like, I don't know, because again, it's just, it's a secret team, so we don't know which team it is. But like, I'm just thinking it couldn't be but so many teams, because again, like, I don't think like Indiana,
No.
or I don't know, Detroit, right, is gonna trade for Lillard, right?
Yeah, we can literally cross them off. We might as well do that. Indiana's not trading for him. Washington's not trading for him.
Right,
Orlando's not. I don't think Charlotte will. Detroit's definitely not. Toronto, maybe. Chicago, no. Miami, obviously, yeah. Atlanta, no. Brooklyn, maybe. New York. New York would be intriguing, but I don't think they'll do it because they have
right,
Brunson.
right.
Cleveland, no. Philly, maybe, but like you said, Harden. Boston, no. Milwaukee, probably not.
Yeah, so that's the issue there. But again, we'll see, because it does seem like it's starting to heat up. So
Yeah.
it's very possible that we might actually finally get something, to talk about in regards to a Lillard trade. It would be nice.
And it needs to be done before training camp so those guys can get a chance to gel.
Right. There was also a thing about Chicago, potentially. But again, it's like, that would probably have to be like Levine. But then they also suggested Portland may not want Levine.
Dude,
Which
that's
again,
my
like you
thing.
already
I don't. Why would they want a guard?
yeah, you already got Scoot. You have Shaden Sharp. I mean, Simons, that's already three guards, and like,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a lot going on
And then
there.
to have your what highest paid player be a guard again, I don't. I don't know.
Yeah, or I guess, in this case, yeah, it'd be Levine and Grant, I think would be their two
Oh yeah,
highest.
Grant. I forgot about Grant. Nasty contract.
Yeah, another rumor that came out according to Shams, Buddy Healed. So, he and the Pacers could not come to deals or to terms on an extension.
Hmm.
So the idea and the thought process is that he's probably going to be traded. Um
Hmm.
Now he
That's
did
intriguing.
suggest out there that it's unlikely he'd be traded until the season starts, which again I understand, right? I don't know, like there's still a couple other deals that could potentially happen that I think might be priority number one. Um, but he did throw out a few teams: Dallas, Philly, Milwaukee. Um, those
Okay.
are really intriguing. I think
Yeah.
because I think again he's one of the best 3-point shooters in the NBA. Gets him up at a high volume.
Yes.
He's really good at it. So I mean,
Hits them at a high volume too.
right, exactly. So I think he could definitely help out a lot of teams. Um, He's on, I think, the last year of his deal, right? So I would imagine he'd want every opportunity, to play, maybe potentially start.
Yes.
Um, I think he could definitely start for Milwaukee. Because again, like, their two guard spot, right? I mean, you got, what, Grayson Allen. So I mean, like, I think he could probably beat out Grayson Allen for the starting two guard spot.
Easily.
Um, and again, I think that'd be a really good fit. Like Holiday, Heald, Middleton, Giannis, Lopez. That's
That would
really
ease their issues.
yeah. Because again, you don't need him to handle the ball. You don't need him to really do a lot of creating. You just need him to shoot.
Hmm.
Uh, there's not a whole lot of guys that are much better at it than him, especially for that contract. Obviously, if he's not hitting right, it goes downhill from there because
Sure.
he doesn't do a whole lot else. But again, just because he's a really good shooter, like I said, one of the best, he's going to command a lot of attention out there. And again, like you could always use more shooting, especially if you're a team that already has a ton of defense.
Yeah.
Because that's really Milwaukee's strength is the defense. The offense has kind of been, like
Sure.
up and down, so for the most part. So I really do like that. Philly, I think, is interesting.
I don't like that one
It
though.
really makes sense to me, like if Harden is gone, because then
Right.
it's like you could have like Maxey and Heald, but then I feel like that's a terrible defensive backcourt.
Yeah.
You do have, I guess, Embiid on the back line, but then you still don't really have a lot of great options at the wing defensively. So,
Yeah.
it's Harris and I guess PJ Tucker. You would think Tucker may be moved if Harden's gone. I don't know, but I don't know. I don't
Yeah. I don't like that.
that quite as much. And
I
then they
like
mentioned
Dallas.
Dallas. I think Dallas is kind of intriguing. Would he
I like
start
that one.
Dallas? I mean, because you have Luca and Kyrie. I guess Luca, because of his size, like he could play with two guards.
Hmm.
'Cause, he's done it before. But then it's
Yeah.
like, none of those guys are guarding, anybody, right? Like,
Sure.
you're not going to ask Buddy Hield, to guard the, guard on the other team,
No, no.
right?
Or
Or
Kyrie
just
or Luca.
exactly. So I don't know. Like, if he's coming off the bench for Dallas, that'd be interesting. But it's like they got Seth Curry on a really good value, and like, he's a really good 3-point shooter. I think. Obviously he's smaller than Hield, but still, like, you already have, I think, a lot of, you know, shooting out there. Um, from that spot. Again, it's not that it's a bad deal, but it's like if you're Dallas, I think you kind of need to figure out some more stuff defensively.
Sure. I
Um,
like it more than Philly though. I will say that.
Right, exactly. So I think I like it the most from Milwaukee. I think that
Me
one's
too.
the best fit. In terms of what they need and what he provides, right? Like that's kind of fits like a glove to me. I'm just curious as to how they would do it, how they would pull it off. Because
Right.
again, like he makes think about like 18-ish million. Because I know his contract goes down every year, so you'd have to figure out what salaries you could put together. Like I said, maybe like a Grayson Allen, and like a couple of their young guys. Because again, I don't know what Indiana would be looking for, for Buddy Hield. Because I don't feel like they get like a great return, right? I think it would more so be like a player for player swap, maybe
Right.
like a second or something. I don't think you're getting a first, just based off of what we've seen from the trade market as of late. Could be
Yeah.
wrong.
I agree with you on that.
Yeah, but do you like the idea, like in terms of like of Buddy Hield being moved, like to I guess clearly teams that are trying to compete and contend.
I mean, like, I would prefer that Indiana keeps him. I think, he is a crucial part of their offense. I think without him, they probably would lose a little bit more games. But if Buddy Hield gets to a contender, like most of the teams that you mentioned are, have their names have been drawn from the hat as contenders pretty much. So it's
Right.
like, but I would really like to see him go to Milwaukee if he is moved. But in terms of where I want him as of right now, probably just to stay in Indiana. I think he's pretty
Yeah.
crucial to that squad.
Yeah, and it's funny because I remember, way back, I guess now at this point, 2 years ago, he was supposed to be a Laker because,
Oh yeah, I
you know,
forgot
they
about that.
they had initially agreed to a deal, that would have sent, I think it was Kuzma and Trez to Sacramento for Buddy Hield because this was while he was in Sacramento,
Right.
but instead they did the Westbrook deal and then they didn't get
Yeah, they
Buddy Hield.
fumbled.
So
I forgot about that.
right, so it is kind of interesting, just because he ended up getting traded eventually, right? Because he was just traded to Indiana in that Halliburton Sabonis deal. So now he's getting traded again. He is 30, right? Despite not being in the league for like that long, he already is 30.
Yeah.
Because I think he was a junior in
Yes,
college when he
you're
was
right.
drafted from Oklahoma, and then I
Yes.
think and like they just forgot that he was actually a year older than what people had. I don't know how because that was already out there. But anyways,
Yeah.
so yeah, so like even though like he was drafted like 4 years, I think, after say like Anthony Davis. They're the same age, which is kind
Yeah,
of wild. So, and like I said, he's basically still in the prime of his, his prime, I guess now. He's a very durable player, right? So he doesn't miss a lot of time. So I think he's a guy, like I said, that could help out a lot of different teams.
for sure.
Just as a shooter. Like I said, I don't think you have to have him as a starter. Um, but
It would be
again,
nice
if
though.
he if they couldn't come to terms on an extension, it would have to almost kind of be like, hey, like I want my money, and like he's gonna get his money if he plays significantly and plays, a decent role for a team. Again,
Exactly.
like I think a team like Milwaukee, that's really good if Milwaukee could pull that off. But
Yeah,
we'll see. So
he fits
I
right in
expect him
there.
probably to get moved. I just don't know where.
Right.
Because it could be some other random team that comes in and just kind of
That
takes him.
happens.
Right, especially, for guys who aren't like, star players, right? Like that makes it a lot easier to trade for those guys than, say like a Lillard where like only a handful of teams are probably going to deal for him.
Sure.
Um, another interesting signing happened. So, again, Kelly Oubre
Oh
finally
yeah.
got signed. It was not Miami though. It was actually the Philadelphia 76ers. So, it's a 1-year deal basically for the minimum. Um, So he's a guy, obviously, and I guess you can attest to this, because he used to play for your team, the
Mm-hmm.
Wizards, drafted by them, right? He's a guy
Yes.
that kind of bounced around. It seems like he's a guy that's got talent.
Yeah.
Especially as a scorer, he's a very good athlete, but it seems like he just hasn't been able to put it together in terms of like impacting, winning teams. He's been
Sure.
on some, his situations have been different, right? Because he was on the Wizards, right, at a time where like they were kind of on the rise, right, where Wall and Beal were really good. Um, then they moved him. I think it was to Phoenix, right, for a
Yes.
reason. Um, you know,
Oh God. Don't
yeah.
remind me.
Then he was on that Phoenix team, that was in the bubble and went undefeated in the bubble, right? And then they traded him in that Chris Paul trade, and then I think Oklahoma City they flipped him to Golden State, right? So, his role in Golden State, was I guess, play a decent role. Initially, I would have assumed it was off the bench, and then Clay got hurt right towards Achilles, so missed all that season. So then he was the starter, and didn't really work out well, right? 3-point shooting wasn't really there. The offense for Golden State was horrible that year. Their defense was really good, but their offense stunk, right? And then as soon as he was kind of out of the rotation, I think it was due to injury, right? Golden State started to make a push, for that play-in spot. So that doesn't really help, his case there.
Yeah.
And then, he's been in Charlotte. Again, he was fine for Charlotte, but they didn't really do anything. So,
Didn't he
I think
average like 20 something last year? But
yeah, I mean, like, so yeah, he had a pretty solid offensive year for
but that
Charlotte.
team sucks.
That
So
didn't really do. Yeah, exactly. On a team that didn't really do a whole lot. So this is kind of like Christian Wood, right? Kind of an opportunity to to show, hey, I can contribute, to winning. I can impact, the game in different ways other than just, essentially just scoring. Um, Because again, this is a minimum contract. So if it doesn't pan out here, right? Again, I'm not saying he's got to learn Chinese, right? But again, like, there's only but so many opportunities you're gonna get. Because again, like, you look at the raw numbers and like, you'd be like, wow, this guy, has been like, a relatively decent offensive player. Why would he
sure.
be a guy who bounces around? Again, kind of like Christian Wood, but you know, again, passing, right? Doesn't really pass the ball a whole lot. Again, not a great outside shooter, kind of a streaky guy, because he's had some games. I think it was a game last year where he just couldn't miss,
Yeah.
from the outside. But
He's a
again, like then
microwave.
other games where yeah, then he has other games where he doesn't hit. So I do kind of like this for Philly as a swing, take a crack at it signing, on a guy that hasn't panned out, and you get him for cheap,
What do
So
you
I
have to
do like
lose?
that for Philly. Yeah, exactly. What do you have to lose? Because again, if it doesn't pan out, it's a minimum contract.
Yeah.
There's probably not too many better guys out there that you can get for the minimum. It's
Exactly.
just it kind of makes things interesting for Miami because you had a couple of guys who were rumored to potentially go to Miami if a Lillard deal had been completed, but now they went elsewhere because these guys aren't going to wait around, because they want to be employed. They don't want to just sit around and just not do anything.
I get it.
Um,
Yeah.
so I do wonder what Miami, kind of does now in terms of like if a Lillard deal does happen, right? They're gonna have to find ways, to kind of pick up the, remaining pieces and figure some stuff out because it's
Yeah.
gonna be, because now it's kind of slim pickings in free agency now where there's not really a whole lot of great options left. So, um, the value signings I think are kind of close to being gone now for the most part. But
Yes.
I do like this for Philly. It's just again, the hardened clouds, kind of being over their head. That's kind of unfortunate because again, if he was kind of all in on the situation, right? I do wonder what it would look like, but who knows at this point with Philly.
Yeah,
But
it's a
I do
tough
like,
situation.
yeah, I do like that signing.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts, on what we said about the Raptors. Because again, maybe you might be a little bit higher on what the Raptors did. We obviously weren't. Um, but let us know in the comments. And again, we appreciate the support. We did pick up another subscriber. Because obviously we're on our way. Trying we have a goal of trying to get to 50 subs. At some point. So hopefully people can help us out with that.
Yeah.
And with that, again, hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next week.